The tapping started on Tuesday, 3 distinct sounds against the wall behind my desk, not loud enough to startle, but persistent enough to draw attention. Like fingernails, but slightly harder, almost like bone striking plaster with deliberate precision. I dismissed it as pipes expanding in the autumn chill, or perhaps the old Victorian apartment settling into its foundation after a century of slow, dignified decay. These sounds belong to aging buildings, I told myself, just as certain creaks belong to human joints, nothing to concern myself with. My apartment occupied the 3rd floor of what had once been a physician's residence in the late 1800s, before the university had purchased and subdivided it into graduate housing. The walls retained their original horsehair plaster, cracked in places to reveal glimpses of the wooden lathe beneath, a skeletal framework normally hidden from view like secrets kept beneath the skin. Ornate crown molding framed ceilings too high for efficient heating, and the floorboards whispered beneath my feet with each step, offering the fragments of conversations from decades past. The building had personality, character, history, all the euphemisms realtors use for structures that have witnessed too much. I'd chosen it despite the draft that perpetually invaded from some untraceable source, despite the way shadows congealed in corners rather than dispersing when lights were switched on. The rent was reasonable, and the solitude suited my research. The department had warned me that previous occupants rarely lasted more than 2 semesters, citing the isolation and the building's peculiar acoustics. Sudden silences that swallowed sound, followed by echoes where none should exist. For some reason, studying the psychological effects of urban soundscapes, these idiosyncrasies were not deterrents but attractions. Before the tapping, I'd been recording the apartment's ambient noise for weeks, capturing the building's sonic vocabulary with specialized equipment borrowed from the university's audio engineering lab, listening to the playback through noise-canceling headphones often revealed sounds I hadn't consciously registered, the subtle shifting of weight in unoccupied rooms, the soft susurration of movement within walls supposedly empty of life. But when it happened again on Wednesday at precisely 3:17 p.m., I know the time because I checked my watch, irritated at the distraction from my dissertation on acoustic anomalies in urban environments. The irony wasn't lost on me. Studying sonic disturbances while being disturbed by sounds that shouldn't exist. 3 taps, always 3, a pattern suggesting intention, a rhythm too precise to be random. I measured the intervals between each sound 0.73 seconds exactly, and the waiting period between sets, 17 minutes. The consistency violated the natural disorder of settling buildings. Nature abhors such precision. I found myself pressing a glass against the wall, an amateur's attempt at amplification. The plaster felt abnormally cool beneath my touch, as if drawing heat from my fingers. Through the glass, the taps transformed deeper, somehow wetter, like something suspended in fluid striking against a membrane. When I pulled the glass away, a perfect circle of condensation remained on the wall, evaporating from the outside in, leaving a momentary bullseye that marked the epicenter of the sound. Each day, the tapping continued. The temperature near the section of wall dropped by incremental degrees. I documented this with obsessive precision, using a digital thermometer to map cold spots that migrated across the plaster like slow-moving glaciers. By Thursday, my breath fogged visibly when I approached the wall, though the thermostat insisted the room remained at a consistent 68 degrees. By Friday, I'd grown accustomed to the daily interruption, even finding myself anticipating it with the anxious attention one might give an incoming storm, both dread and curiosity intertwined. The pattern had evolved subtly, still 3 taps, but with a lingering resonance that seemed to vibrate in my molars rather than my eardrums. I found myself setting up recording equipment 5 minutes before the expected time, adjusting microphone sensitivity to capture what human ears might miss. What I hadn't expected was to meet Morgan. The university library had always been my sanctuary, the smell of aged paper and wood polish, the hushed reverence of scholars navigating towering shelves like penitents in a cathedral of knowledge. The Braddock Memorial Library had been built in 1912, a limestone monolith with vaulted reading rooms and narrow stacks that seemed to reconfigure themselves when no one was looking. Students told stories of becoming lost among the shelves, emerging hours later to find that more time had passed than they'd experienced. The building's acoustics were renowned. A whisper at one end of the main reading room could be heard with perfect clarity at the opposite corner, while conversations held in the center were swallowed by inexplicable silence. I was hidden in my usual alcove, a recessed window seat on the 4th floor overlooking the northern quad, surrounded by reference books on psychoacoustics, when I noticed her watching me from between the stacks. The space between shelves appeared narrower than regulation width, forcing her to stand at an uncomfortable angle, her shoulder blades pressed against bound journals from the previous century. She had the kind of face that's difficult to place in time, features that could belong to an antique photograph or to someone you passed on the street yesterday. Her complexion carried an unsettling pallor, as if viewed through slightly yellowed film, yet her cheeks bore a flush that appeared and receded in pulses, not synchronized with any visible breathing pattern. Her eyes, though, carried an intensity that felt immediately invasive, as if she were cataloging my weaknesses, measuring the distance between vulnerability and exploitation. For several minutes, she remained motionless, observing me with the unblinking attention of a predator assessing prey. When she finally moved, the transition from stillness to motion happened too suddenly, lacking the subtle preliminary adjustments that usually telegraph human movement. One moment frozen, the next approaching my table with deliberate steps that made no sound against the marble floor. "You hear them too, don't you?" she asked without introduction, sliding into the chair across from me with fluid grace that nonetheless contained minute imperfections, as if her motions had been studied rather than instinctively developed. Her voice was melodic but slightly flat, like an instrument missing a vital harmonic, the consonants too precisely enunciated, while vowels stretched a millisecond too long. The effect was hypnotic, drawing attention to the shape of her words rather than their meaning. The repetitive percussions emanating from architectural boundaries, 3 successive impacts, consistently spaced. "Excuse me?" I said, aware that my own voice had dropped to match her conspiratorial tone, a psychological mimicry that felt involuntary, as though her cadence had rewired my vocal patterns merely through proximity. My throat tightened, words emerging with effort through a peculiar resistance. "The echoes, the sounds that aren't supposed to be there." She leaned forward, elbows sliding across the polished oak at an angle that should have produced friction, but didn't. I caught a scent that reminded me of rain on hot concrete, of ozone and copper pennies, and something underneath. Medical, almost formaldehyde-like. The scent of preservation. "You've been researching them for months. I've watched you collecting your little references, building your theories." Her fingernails, unnaturally tapered and lacking clearly defined knuckles, extended toward my notebook. She tapped the cover 3 times, the sound identical to the tapping in my apartment. Bone against resistance. "But you're looking in the wrong places." The taps resonated through the table, vibrating up through my forearms with unnatural intensity. Each point of impact left a small circular indentation in the leather cover, tiny craters that seemed to deepen as I stared at them, as if continuing to receive pressure long after her fingertips had withdrawn. The marks arranged themselves in a perfect equilateral triangle. I should have been alarmed by her admission of surveillance, disturbed by the implication that my privacy had been systematically violated by this stranger with her too smooth movements and carefully assembled features. But instead, I felt a strange relief spreading through my chest like ice water, cooling the anxiety that had been building since the tapping began. Someone else had noticed. Someone else heard it too. The validation of shared experience, even from a source that raised every instinctive warning, felt intoxicating. "Who are you?" I asked, noticing how my tongue felt thick against my palate, how my lips seemed to form shapes adjacent to, but not precisely matching the words I've intended. Across from me, the woman's mouth curved into what approximated a smile, all appropriate components present, but assembled with subtle incorrectness, like a puzzle completed with pieces forced into positions they weren't designed to occupy. "Morgan Lettner, Department of Architectural Acoustics." She placed a business card on the table, heavy stock embossed with an unfamiliar university logo that seemed to shift slightly when not directly observed. The institution's name rendered in letterpress that left deep impressions on the paper. The card felt abnormally cool to the touch, as if recently removed from refrigeration, and carried a faint scent of mineral oil and something organic that resisted identification. "But more importantly, I'm someone who knows what you're hearing isn't pipes or settling foundations." The certainty in her statement bypassed intellectual assessment and resonated with something primal in my hindbrain, the recognition that prey feels when a predator articulates the precise nature of its vulnerability. The hairs along my forearms raised, responding to a change in atmospheric pressure that coincided with her words, as if the air between us had become marginally thinner. My heart quickened its rhythm, momentarily syncing with the remembered pattern of the taps. Groups of 3 separated by waiting spaces. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, imperceptibly quick, but long enough to cast Morgan's features in a momentary shadow that accentuated the slight asymmetry of her face. Left eye a fraction higher than the right. mouth canted at an angle that suggested an underlying structural deviation from standard human anatomy. What is it then? My question emerged as barely more than a whisper, breath shallow as if preparing for impact. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, which remained fixed on mine with pupillary dilation inconsistent with the library's ambient lighting. The expression appeared practiced rather than instinctive. Each component lifted corners of lips, exposed teeth, creased cheeks, executed separately rather than as a unified emotional response, a simulation of human expression rendered by an intelligence that understood the mechanics but not the integration. "Not what?" she replied, her tongue briefly visible as it enunciated, its color slightly too pale, its movement suggesting a different muscular structure than expected. "But who?" Morgan explained her theory as we walked across the campus, the late afternoon sun casting our shadows at peculiar angles that seemed to stretch further than they should, disconnecting occasionally from our feet when we crossed uneven terrain. The shadows moved with a slight delay as if transmitting our movements through some resident medium before manifesting them. According to her, certain buildings, those constructed during specific years using specific materials, could develop what she called echo chambers. Not the acoustic phenomenon, but literal spaces where something resided. Architectural resonance creates pockets of aberrant physics, she said, her cadence metronomic, technical terminology flowing with unnatural fluency. Particular combinations of material properties, lath and plaster with specific mineral compositions, old-growth timber with certain growth ring patterns, iron with high carbon content can develop membrane characteristics under sustained vibrational influence. The quad had emptied as we walked, students and faculty vanishing with the fading light, leaving us isolated in the vast open space between academic buildings. The silence pressed against my eardrums, a negative pressure that made each of Morgan's words arrive with painful clarity, bypassing normal auditory processing to embed themselves directly in my consciousness. "They're attracted to liminal places," she continued, gesturing to the narrow spaces between buildings, the shadowed corners where architecture failed to meet perfectly, the threshold spaces that existed between defined purposes. Her finger traced architectural junctures with disturbing precision, identifying structural weaknesses invisible to untrained observation. "The gaps in our constructed reality, the spaces that exist between definitions, not quite wall, not quite corner, not quite stairwell, not quite hallway. They've always been there, parasitizing these undefined zones, but they're getting more numerous, more bold." As she spoke, I noticed how outdoor ambient noises, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, the hum of HVAC systems seemed to fade at irregular intervals, creating pockets of preternatural silence that swallowed portions of her sentences, leaving unnatural pauses that my brain automatically filled with meanings that felt simultaneously foreign and yet familiar. "What are they?" I asked, trying to keep my skepticism from my voice despite the uneasy resonance her words created in my mind. The question emerged, distorted, as if spoken through water, consonants bleeding into vowels. A spider crawled across the concrete 6 feet ahead, stopped precisely in our path, and then abruptly desiccated, collapsing inward as if subjugated to intense pressure. "We call them residents," Morgan replied, her pace slowing as we approached the Humanities building where my office was located, a brutalist concrete structure incongruously wedged between Victorian-era halls. The building had always seemed wrong, its proportions subtly offensive to the eye, its windows placed at intervals that created an impression of facial features, a massive, watching countenance embedded in institutional architecture. They exist alongside us, but not quite in the same frequency. Think of reality as radio waves. Most people only pick up on the main channel, but some of us can hear the static between stations. She stopped at the building's entrance, her hand resting on the metal door handle without applying pressure. The metal fogged around her fingers despite the warmth of the day, frost patterns blooming and receding in rapid cycles. The static isn't random noise, it's another broadcast altogether. She stopped suddenly, her head tilting at an angle that exceeded comfortable range of motion, as if listening to something beyond my perception. The tendons in her neck stood out in sharp relief against too pale skin, anatomically correct, yet somehow wrong in their configuration, fibers visible where they shouldn't be, moving independently of each other rather than as coordinated structures. Her pupils dilated in the relative brightness, an inversion of normal physiological response. "Your building has one," she whispered, though the words arrived at normal conversational volume. "Perhaps more. They congregate in structures with specific resonant frequencies, architectural harmonics that match their vibrational structure. They tap on walls, testing strength and permeability, trying to find someone who can hear them, someone who might—" She hesitated, tongue darting out to moisten her lips that seemed not to require it. The gesture, learned rather than instinctive, "help them cross over." Her phrasing carried ecclesiastical overtones, suggesting deathbed rites rather than physical traversal. Yet the spiritual connotation felt intentionally misleading, a familiar framework applied to an utterly foreign concept. The space around us seemed to compress slightly, air molecules crowding closer together, creating a momentary pressure change that made my ears pop painfully. I laughed, a nervous sound that died quickly in the still air, absorbed by some quality in the atmosphere that dampened acoustic transmission. The laughter felt foreign in my throat, a physiological response disconnected from any genuine amusement, mere social reflex in the face of cognitive dissonance. "That's absurd. You're suggesting some kind of supernatural entity is trying to communicate with me?" "Not supernatural," Morgan corrected, her tone sharpening to something that approximated offense but contained too much precision to be genuinely reactive. Her consonants hardened, acquiring a clicking quality that reminded me of insect mandibles. Such classifications are human categorical errors. They are no more supernatural than bacterium were before microscopes, or radiation before detection equipment. Just different. Evolved to exist in spaces we can't perceive, at frequencies outside our standard sensory range. At least, most people can't perceive them. She looked at me with unsettling directness, her gaze fixed not on my eyes, but at a point approximately 2 centimeters behind them, focusing on something within my skull rather than on its surface. "But you can. You have heightened sensitivity to the infrasonic frequencies." unusually acute pattern recognition in auditory stimuli, and a neurological structure compatible with receiving their transmissions. That's why I've been watching you. You're receptive." The word receptive emerged with distinct enunciation, each syllable separated by a microscopic pause, lending the term a ritualistic significance. The moment she spoke it, a sharp pain lanced through my left temple, accompanied by a brief auditory hallucination. The 3 taps from my apartment walls perfectly reproduced inside my cranium. I should have walked away then, should have dismissed her as delusional, perhaps even reported her concerning behavior to campus security. Every evolutionary instinct developed over millennia of predator avoidance screamed caution, recognition of a threat pattern not yet consciously identified, but registered on cellular levels. The primitive brain structures responsible for survival recognized danger in her subtle wrongness long before my prefrontal cortex could rationalize it. Instead, I found myself inviting her to my office, curiosity overriding self-preservation with the same compulsion that draws moths to the flame. Recognition of destruction paired with inability to resist its allure. The decision felt simultaneously voluntary and coerced, as if my agency had been subtly redirected rather than overtly commandeered. We ascended to the 4th floor via the service stairwell, Morgan declining the elevator with a terse comment about interference patterns in vertical conveyance systems. The enclosed concrete shaft amplified our footsteps with asymmetrical acoustics, her steps producing minimal sound despite her formal shoes, while my softer-soled loafers generated echoes that multiplied and distorted, returning to my ears as irregular patterns unrelated to our actual pace. The tapping began the moment we entered my office. 3 distinct sounds against the wall behind my desk, loud enough to disturb loose papers, specific enough in location to create visible vibrations in the water glass on my desk. The liquid formed perfect concentric circles from each impact, the pattern too mathematically precise for natural transmission of kinetic energy through building materials. Morgan smiled, a tight expression that conveyed validation rather than pleasure, the motion practiced rather than spontaneous. The corners of her mouth extended marginally further than human musculature should permit, exposing canines that caught the fluorescent light with unnatural reflectivity. "They know I'm here," she whispered, her breath carrying no discernible warmth or moisture as it passed my cheek. "They recognize a facilitator." The word hung in the air between us, almost visible in its phonetic components, more signal than vocabulary. The temperature in the office dropped suddenly, condensation forming on metal surfaces, paper clips, stapler, the aluminum frame of my desk lamp, while leaving porous materials untouched. "A what?" My question emerged slurred, temporal processing affected by whatever change had occurred in the room's atmospheric conditions. The air felt thicker, offering resistance to sound waves, transforming normal speech into something that required excessive effort to penetrate the suddenly viscous medium. "Someone who helps them integrate," she replied, approaching the wall with careful steps that left momentary indentations in the carpet too deep for her apparent weight, as if mass and gravitational interaction fluctuated with each movement. She placed her palm flat against the plaster, her eyes closing in concentration, lids descending with mechanical precision rather than the typical human blink pattern. "This one is old," she continued, voice dropping an octave, acquiring harmonics that vibrated fillings in my molars. "Been here since the building was renovated in 1973. Incorporated itself into the structural matrix during reconstruction, establishing a dwelling space within dimensional inconsistencies created during architectural transition. It's hungry." The final word arrived as both sound and sensation, a hollowness that bloomed behind my sternum, an emphatic transmission of absence that demanded filling. The tapping increased in tempo, still grouped in threes, but with shortened intervals, an accelerating pulse that suggested anticipation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I wrapped my arms around myself, watching as Morgan began to whisper words in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Phrases about openings and passages, invitations and thresholds. The wall beneath her hand darkened as if a shadow had fallen across it from inside the plaster. For a moment, just the briefest instant, I thought I saw something move within that darkness, a suggestion of form that my mind couldn't properly process. Morgan stepped back abruptly, her composure fractured. "We need to leave now." Outside, in the fading daylight, she regained her composure and handed me a small device resembling a hearing aid. "Wear this. It will help you identify them. The residents sometimes occupy people. Use them as vessels while they learn to exist in our reality." "You can't be serious," I said, though I found myself accepting the device anyway. "The tapping is just the beginning," she continued, ignoring my protest. "Next come the whispers, then the dreams. By the time they start appearing in reflections, it's usually too late." She checked her watch, a peculiar mechanical thing with too many dials. "I have another appointment. We'll meet again soon. Remember, 3 taps means they're still outside. If you hear 4, She let the sentence hang unfinished. As she walked away, I noticed her shadow detach from her feet slightly too late, following her with a delay that defied physics. The device remained in my pocket for 3 days before curiosity overcame caution. It resembled a Bluetooth earpiece, but was slightly heavier, with an iridescent sheen to its surface that changed color depending on the angle of light. When I finally placed it on my ear, the world shifted. Ordinary sounds acquired new dimensions. Conversations carried undertones I'd never noticed. Electronic devices emitted harmonics that seemed to form patterns just beyond comprehension. But most disturbing were the spaces that should have been silent. They hummed with activity, a constant background murmur like a crowded room heard through thick walls. I wore it to my graduate seminar the next morning. The lecture hall had always felt overlarge for our small cohort of doctoral candidates, its high ceilings and poor acoustics creating distant echoes of the professor's words. With the device, however, I heard other voices in those echoes, fragments of conversations that didn't match what was being said, words that seemed to answer questions no one had asked. Professor Whitaker paused mid-sentence, his gaze finding mine across the room. "Dr. Chambers, are you feeling well? You look rather pale." I muttered something about insufficient sleep and tried to focus on his lecture about infrasonic frequencies in urban environments, but my attention kept drifting to the strange behavior I noticed in him. The way he sometimes spoke to empty corners of the room, how his movements occasionally lagged by microseconds, as if his body were receiving delayed signals from his brain. When he wrote equations on the board, his chalk sometimes continued for a moment after his hand had stopped, leaving faint extensions of the symbols that disappeared when I blinked. After class, he called me to his desk. "I understand you've been speaking with Dr. Lettner," he said without preamble. My pulse quickened. "You know Morgan?" His smile was perfectly normal, professionally concerned. "There's no Dr. Morgan Lettner in the Architectural Acoustics Department, Mr. Chambers. In fact, we don't have an Architectural Acoustics Department at this university." Ice spread through my veins. "But I met her at the library. She gave me her card." "May I see it?" he interrupted, hand extended. The card wasn't in my wallet. I searched every pocket, increasingly frantic, remembering clearly placing it there after our meeting. Professor Whitaker watched my search with an expression of clinical interest, his head tilted at an angle that suddenly seemed unnatural. "Perhaps you should consider taking some time off," he suggested, his voice carrying that strange, flat quality I'd noticed in Morgan's. "Your dissertation work on acoustic anomalies seems to be affecting your perception." As I left his office, I heard it. 3 distinct taps from within the walls beside his door. Then, after a pause that stretched my nerves to breaking, a 4th tap that sounded wetter, softer, like something pressing against the barrier from the inside. I spent the weekend researching Morgan Lettner, searching academic databases and social media, finding nothing that matched the woman I'd met. The university had no record of her employment, and the logo on her business card, which I could recall with perfect clarity despite its absence, matched no educational institution in existence. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams of walls that breathed and shadows that moved independently of their casters. I began to notice patterns in everyday occurrences. Certain people blinked too rarely. Some moved with subtle discontinuities, as if frames were missing from the film of their existence. The device remained in my ear. I couldn't bring myself to remove it, convinced it was protecting me somehow, allowing me to see what lurked beneath the surface of ordinary reality. The tapping in my apartment had increased in frequency and location, no longer just behind my desk, but in the bathroom walls, the kitchen ceiling, the closet door. Always 3 taps, never 4, not yet. On Sunday evening, my girlfriend Elise arrived unannounced, concern etched onto her features. "You haven't answered my calls for days," she said, brushing past me into the apartment. "Your advisor called me. He's worried about you." I hadn't spoken to my advisor in weeks. The realization sent a chill through me. "Who really are you?" I asked, maintaining distance between us. Through the device, her voice carried strange harmonics, a subtle, doubling effect as if 2 voices were speaking in perfect synchronization. Elise sighed, dropping her bag onto my couch. "This is exactly what he was worried about. You're having some kind of episode, Julian. First the woman who doesn't exist, now this paranoia." She reached for me, and I flinched away. "Don't touch me," I whispered, backing toward the kitchen where I knew a knife block sat within reach. Her expression shifted from concern to something colder. "You're wearing it, aren't you? The device she gave you." Her eyes flicked to my ear, narrowing slightly. "Take it out, Julian. It's affecting your perception." "How do you know about the device?" My hand found the handle of a knife, fingers closing around it with terrifying certainty. Elise's movements changed, becoming smoother, more deliberate, like a predator sensing its prey's awareness. "Professor Whitaker told me everything about your delusions, your deteriorating mental state. We want to help you." "We?" The word hung between us, damning in its plurality. She took a step forward, and for an instant, a fraction of a second that burned itself into my consciousness, her face seemed to slip, like a mask momentarily askew. Beneath it, I glimpsed something that had too many features arranged in configurations that defied anatomical possibility. "You're one of them," I gasped, raising the knife. "A resident." "Julian, listen to yourself," she pleaded, her voice perfectly modulated to convey concern. Too perfect. "You're threatening me with a knife because of some fantasy about people being, what, possessed? Replaced? This isn't you." "The real Elise would know where we met," I challenged, my grip tightening on the knife. "Tell me where we met." She didn't hesitate. "Coffee shop on Marshall Street. You spilled your drink on my thesis notes and bought me dinner to apologize." Exactly right. Precisely how it had happened. My certainty wavered, the knife lowering slightly. Then I heard it. 3 taps from inside the wall directly behind her, followed after a pregnant pause by a 4th. Wet. Definitive. Elise's head turned toward the sound, the movement too fluid, her neck extending slightly beyond natural limits. When she looked back at me, her smile revealed teeth that seemed subtly, terribly wrong. Too uniform, like plastic approximations of human dentition. "The device is malfunctioning," she said, her voice now carrying that same flatness I'd heard in Morgan's. "It's making you see things that aren't there. Let me take it out for you." She lunged, her movements suddenly too fast to track properly, fingers extending toward my face with unnatural precision. I reacted without thinking, the knife finding resistance, then yielding flesh with sickening ease. Elise looked down at the blade embedded in her abdomen, her expression more confused than pained. "Julian," she whispered, "what have you done?" But as blood bloomed across her skirt, real blood, human blood, her face remained composed, showing none of the shock or agony such a wound should produce. Instead, she reached again for my ear, fingers stretching impossibly. I stumbled backwards, yanking the knife free and bringing it up in a defensive arc that caught her across the throat. The wound gaped open, exposing structures that pulsed and shifted in ways no human anatomy should. For a moment, time seemed suspended as we stared at each other. Me in horror at what I'd done. Her in what almost looked like satisfaction. Then she collapsed, her body hitting the floor with a sound too heavy for her slight frame. The blood that pooled beneath her moved strangely, flowing in patterns that seemed to form symbols before my eyes. I fled the apartment, the knife still clutched in my bloodied hand. The campus was deserted at that hour, streetlights casting pools of sickly yellow illumination across the empty sidewalks. I found myself at the Humanities Building, drawn there by some instinct I couldn't name. The doors should have been locked, but they opened at my touch, swinging inward to reveal darkened hallways that seemed longer than they should be. Professor Whitaker's office light was on, a slice of brightness visible beneath his door. I approached cautiously, the knife hidden against my forearm, aware of the blood drying tacky on my skin. I didn't knock. The door was unlocked, opening silently to reveal not Whitaker, but Morgan, seated behind his desk as if she belonged there. She looked up, unsurprised by my appearance or condition. "You've had a difficult evening," she observed, her tone conversational. "But necessary experiences often are." "I killed her," I said, the words hollow in my mouth. "Elise, she was wrong, one of them." Morgan's expression remained neutral. "Was she? Or did the device simply make you perceive her that way?" Doubt crashed over me like a physical wave. "The device. You gave it to me. You told me about the residents, about how they take over people." "Did I?" She tilted her head, the movement fluid yet somehow mechanical. "Or did you imagine our entire interaction based on your research into acoustic anomalies? Psychosis often builds on existing preoccupations, creating elaborate systems that make perfect sense to the sufferer." "You're real," I insisted, though uncertainty had begun to erode my conviction. "We met in the library. You told me about the echo chambers, about the tapping." "The human mind is remarkably adept at constructing memories to support its delusions," Morgan replied, rising from the chair with that same uncanny grace I remembered. "There's no architectural acoustics department. There's no Morgan Lettner." As she stepped around the desk, light fell across her features, illuminating a face that was simultaneously familiar and yet wrong. Features that matched my memory, yet seemed assembled rather than grown, like a masterful forgery of a painting that doesn't withstand close inspection. "Then what are you?" I whispered, the knife suddenly heavy in my hand. Her smile widened beyond the limits of human anatomy, revealing rows of teeth extending too far into her cheeks. "I'm whatever you need me to be, Julian. A government agent warning you about parasitic invaders? A fellow researcher validating your theories? A figment of your fractured psyche?" She leaned closer, her breath carrying the scent of ozone and copper. "Or perhaps I'm exactly what I claimed to be, a facilitator, helping the residents find suitable vessels." The walls around us began to pulse, the plaster rippling like the surface of disturbed water. Shadow figures moved within them, suggestions of forms both human and profoundly not, pressing against the membrane between their reality and mine. "You killed poor Elise for nothing," Morgan continued, her voice acquiring layers of other voices, speaking in unison. "She was entirely human, but her death served a purpose. It created a vacancy." I backed toward the door, knife extended. "Stay away from me." "The echo chambers are filling, Julian," she said, following me with measured steps. "Soon there will be more of us than you. The tapping is just the beginning, our way of testing the barriers, finding the weak points, the truly receptive ones like you." From within the walls came a sound. Not 3 taps, but a continuous rhythmic pounding, like dozens of fists demanding entry. The shadows grew more defined, limbs and faces pressing against the plaster until it bulged outward in obscene geometries. "They're coming through," Morgan whispered, her face beginning to shift, features migrating across her skin like insects beneath fabric, "and you've helped them find the way." I ran, dropping the knife, tearing the device from my ear and casting it aside. The corridor stretched impossibly, doorways multiplying as I passed them, each revealing glimpses of scenes that couldn't exist, landscapes of twisted architecture, skies the wrong color, figures assembled from parts that were almost but not quite human. When I finally burst outside, the night air struck me like a physical blow, shocking in its normalcy. I collapsed on the lawn, gasping, waiting for pursuit that never came. They found me there the next morning, campus security, then the police, then the paramedics who sedated me when I couldn't stop screaming about the things living in the walls. They discovered Elise's body in my apartment, exactly where I'd left her. The wounds matched the knife found in Professor Whitaker's office. My fingerprints and her blood mingled on its handle. There was no Morgan Lettner, no device, no strange symbols formed by Elise's blood, just a doctoral candidate who had suffered a psychotic break, killed his girlfriend during a delusional episode, and left a confession of sorts in his professor's office. The psychiatric facility where they placed me is quiet, the walls thick enough to muffle most sounds. My medication keeps the worst of the delusions at bay, the doctors tell me. The tapping I sometimes hear is just a side effect of the antipsychotics, they assure me. Nothing to be concerned about. My new roommate arrived yesterday. He moves with peculiar grace, his smile too wide, his eyes focusing slightly to the side of whatever he looks at. When the orderlies leave us alone, he sits on the edge of his bed and watches me with unblinking attention. "I hear you're receptive," he says, his voice carrying that familiar, flat quality beneath its apparent normalcy, that you can hear them tapping. I pretend not to understand, focusing on the journal they've encouraged me to keep as part of my therapy. But at night, when the lights are dim and the staff make their hourly rounds, I hear him whispering to the wall, words in that language I shouldn't understand but do, about openings and passages and invitations and thresholds. And the walls whisper back. Sometimes, when I look at my reflection in the small, shatterproof mirror above our sink, I notice my movements continuing for a fraction of a second after I've stopped, my smile extending just slightly too far, my eyes focusing on empty corners of the room as if seeing something there. The doctors say I'm making excellent progress. Soon, they tell me, I might be ready for reintegration into society. They see my improved affect as a sign of recovery, not recognizing the void that has replaced my terror. After all, why fear what you've become? The echo chambers are filling. The tapping has stopped. No need for it now that the barriers have thinned to transparency. Soon there will be more of them than us, but perhaps that was always inevitable. From the first moment, someone heard 3 distinct sounds against a wall and paused to listen. I tap my fingers against the journal's cover as I write these final entries, 1, 2, 3. And then, with what remains of my humanity, I resist the urge to add a 4th. Thanks for listening to my Dark Veil tale. Make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. It really does help me grow this channel so I can make more content for your enjoyment. Also, check out the linked video for another creeper-style story from Dark Veil Tales.